In this Dragon's Dogma 2 video, I want to talk a little bit about an expansion or a possible DLC for this game. Nothing's been confirmed yet. There have been leaks suggesting there might be one in development. We don't know for sure. I think it's safe to say that there was probably at some point a plan for a DLC to be created, simply because the game seems to be very similar to the first game. The first game had Bitter Black Isle. People really loved Bitter Black Isle, myself included. I really loved the dungeon crawling content and the new enemies in that area. So I think it's safe to say that Capcom probably had a plan for a DLC at some point. I don't know if that's still the case or not, but let's get into whether that's likely to happen now because of everything, or, and if it does happen, what do we want in this DLC? So before launch of this game, playing up in the early access period before all the reviews went out, I was pretty convinced this game was going to have a DLC. Again, because it's so similar to the first game, I think Capcom is pretty predictable in their development cycle. Like, it's not hard to really figure out what they're going to do with their games. They're pretty, they have a pretty predictable pattern compared to some other developers. So I think expecting a DLC for this game would not be crazy, particularly, again, because how successful Bitter Black Isle was for Dragon's Dogma 1. However, with all the hubbub that happened at the launch of the game and the outrage over the microtransactions that were in the game, the performance issues, the save issue, I don't know if Capcom is still planning on doing this. Obviously, if they were already in development of a DLC, I think it would be weird for them to cancel it. But if they hadn't started development, they might be second guessing whether they're going to do it at this point. They might just be ready to move on from this project. I imagine that all that backlash hurt their sales significantly, even though the game has performed rather well and is outperforming the first game in terms of sales. Obviously, we don't know how much better it could have been if that hadn't happened, and obviously if these issues were not present in the game. So it's really hard to say at this point if there's actually going to be a DLC or not. Now, Capcom has a survey up that's available until the 21st, so if you haven't, gone and answered it, you should, especially if you want to see DLC. You can say in that survey whether you would pay for a DLC and how much you would pay for it. So I highly recommend going to fill out that survey if this is something that you're interested in. And obviously, there's a lot of other questions in there that you can fill out for Capcom and just give them feedback in general, and I think that's good, whether you have positives or negatives to say about the game, or both. So that being said, we don't know if there's going to be a DLC, but if there was a DLC or an expansion for Dragon's Dogma 2, I think it would be a huge opportunity for Capcom. As good as Dragon's Dogma 2 is, and it's still by far my favorite game I've played this year, I think it would be disingenuous to say that it's not sort of disappointing. This could have been a game that was one of the all-time greats, and instead it's probably not even going to win Game of the Year. And there are a lot of reasons for that. The enemy variety of the game, was basically the same as the first game, in some cases even less enemies. The weapon and armor variety was maybe even less than the first game, or about the same, even though the game space was much larger. There was no Everfall or Ur-Dragon, things that really were special to the first game. And I think because things like that were not in this game, they didn't really innovate on some of the mechanics of the game. A lot of the clunkiness and stuff is still present in this game. I think a lot of people, even though they love it, are still kind of disappointed in what they got in the base game, myself included. Really love the game, but I feel like it could have been something so much better. And because of that, again, Capcom has a real opportunity, if they do create a DLC, to really rectify some of those issues, not only by adding new content for players to play, but also by cleaning up some of that stuff and maybe adding some of that stuff into the base game. The best expansions, in my opinion, are not just ones that add something for people to do that have reached the end of a story or end of a campaign, but also improve the base game in some way, like a Game of the Year edition, or some sort of improvement to the base game as well, so that when players come through to play again, their next playthrough was better than the first one, or brand new players that are playing the game for the first time enjoy the game even more than we did when we played it, because they have a better experience because of these things being added and tweaked and improved between now and whenever, that DLC comes out. So I really hope that Capcom takes this opportunity to tweak some of these things, and we'll get into what these are. So first on the list should probably be more enemy variety. I think this is probably the biggest complaint outside of performance and the microtransactions and the one save slot. The biggest complaint from people, I think, by far, is the enemy variety of the game. And if they really want to make the DLC a success, they are probably going to need to do a few things. They're going to have to add a significant amount of enemy types because they really need to add more to the base game itself. And they also need to make some that are probably unique to a new DLC area, whether that's like Bitter Black Isle and a dungeon crawl, or whether that's like a new zone or some combination of those two things. So they probably can't just add the amount of enemies you'd expect in a DLC. They probably need to add a bit more and then take some of those and pepper the beginning, or the base campaign with some of those in order to make it more fresh, and then keep some and for the DLC area so that it feels different and you're not just playing the same enemies through the base game and then again in the DLC. And there's been a lot of internal debate over here at Fextra Life about, if we had to choose between like a new zone and a dungeon crawl like Bitter Black Isle, what would we choose? And I think if we couldn't have both of those things, which I think obviously would be great, I think we would lean more towards the Bitter Black Isle side of things. Dungeon crawling in Bitter Black Isle was fantastic. Very well loved expansion by people that played Dragon's Dogma 1, myself included, and I really loved that experience. So if they added something like that, along with, peppering new enemies into the base game, I would be probably satisfied. And if they went on beyond that and added a new zone on top of that, I would be thrilled, but I don't think I would be quite as happy if they just added a new zone with similar content to the base game. So the next thing to talk about is obviously, weapons and armor, adding more of that to the game. Bitter Black Isle did that in the expansion for Dragon's Dogma 1, so obviously if Dragon's Dogma 2 has an expansion, I think it's safe to say there will be a lot more weapons and armor, and hopefully it's a significant amount. But I think the thing is here, I don't want to see them just add more weapons and armor. I would really love it if they added more weapons with special effects, because some of the weapons in Dragon's Dogma 2 have special effects if you read the flavor text, and some armor that had special effects. To my knowledge, none of the armor in Dragon's Dogma 2 has any sort of special effects. And this is one of the things that I really love about Elden Ring and the Souls games, is that if you read the armor sometimes, you see things about it, or a shield or whatever, and it's got special effects on it. And I really think that if they added that to this game, even retroactively to armor that already exists, it would be a huge improvement to the game and add depth to the base game for people that have never played or are playing a new playthrough or doing NG Plus or something like that. And even adding more depth to that, I would really love to see the upgrade system of Dragon's Dogma 2 expanded upon. I really like what they have for a foundation, and it's certainly good enough, but I think it could be improved more by allowing players to specialize their equipment even more, whether there's another tier of upgrades that allows you to go in different directions, maybe adding special effects, or maybe having like a rune slot for weapons and armor that can change the properties of a skill or something to give more depth to the weapons and armor system. Because right now, as far as armor goes, you're really just picking like what has the best physical and magic armor and knockdown resistance, and you're not really, you don't need to read the flavor tests or anything like that. And for weapons, typically you're just going for the highest DPS or highest DPS with the highest knockdown, and there really isn't, even though a lot of weapons do have special effects, people are more often than not using them for the special effects. They're using for, the attack power or the knockdown, etc. And they can do all kinds of clever things with weapons and armor, and I think it kind of ties into my next point, which is, that the game should probably have new skills added for each vocation, or new vocations added, or both. Right? Like, one of the things that kind of gets tiresome in the game, or can make it feel more repetitive, particularly when you're fighting the same enemies a lot, is that you have the same skill rotation generally. If you're playing a mage, for instance, and you have like 3 skill slots that are like support spells, and maybe you have one spell that's like high 11 just so you have some attacks, when you're fighting trash enemies, you're probably not taking the time to buff everyone. You're probably just attacking with like high 11. So your combat or your gameplay experience as mage when you're fighting regular enemies, which is probably like 50% of the game, is just spamming high 11. But what if they added like equipment that made it so you had like a chance to free cast a spell when you cast high 11, or maybe you had a chance to free cast an offensive spell when you cast a defensive spell or a buff? Like, there are ways they can incorporate equipment into making skills more effective or different, so that it doesn't feel like you're always just using the same attacks. Particularly when you're playing mage or sorcerer, it just feels like you're just spamming the same spells over and over, and that's your combat. Like, they have to come up with a way to make that feel fresh, and I think that's either through new skills, new vocations, equipment that synergizes with skills, or maybe allowing you to have multiple vocations, something to this effect. And again, what that would do is that would allow someone to play the game from the beginning, whether it's a new playthrough or it's their first time playing, with more content to play through the base game with, because they have access to new vocations if they own the DLC, or new skills that can make their playthrough better. And, this is kind of like a Game of the Year edition or something like that. An edition that not just adds stuff to do at the end, but then also adds stuff that makes a first playthrough or a second playthrough even better and just makes the general experience of the game better. And then I think lastly, the main thing is they have to create something for people that have played through the game, right? Like if you're talking about the new zone or a dungeon crawl, you're going to want to set the difficulty of this on par for a character that's made it through the game. Like this is a high level character. Dragon's Dogma 2 itself is not very challenging, and that's fine. Not every game has to be challenging. But I do think there should either be some optional content that's very challenging for people who want more of a challenge, or just to create content, that's aimed at people that are higher level, so it's not easy and it's very difficult. Bitter Black Isle was not easy in my opinion compared to the base game in Dragon's Dogma 1, so I think it would be great if they had, something that was a bit more upscaled or challenging for those out there who want to continue playing the game, because I got to imagine that most of the people buying the expansion are people that have played through the game once already, and they're definitely going to want something that's going to be good for them and not feel like they're just face rolling. So that kind of wraps up my video on Dragon's Dogma 2 DLC. Do you guys think that we're going to get one now, with the launch of the game not going as smoothly? Do you think it was already planned and they're just going to do it anyway? Are you going to fill out the survey and, give feedback to Capcom about this? What do you want to see in a DLC if there is one? Do the things I'm saying make sense? Did I forget anything? Do you want them to add like more quests or, other things to the game? Let me know in the comments below.